celebrated American psychic Edgar CAYCE would lie down, pray, and enter a trance-like state of altered consciousness. In this state, CAYCE diagnosed illnesses in medical terms he knew nothing of awake. He described distant events as they were happening, talked of past lives and incarnations in the fabled Atlantis. He predicted the stock market crash of 1929, the fall of communism, and warned of cataclysmic earth changes that would send cities tumbling into the sea. Through thousands of his readings, as they are called, Edgar CAYCE has become the most documented psychic of the 20th century. On a Sunday afternoon on March 18, 1877, Edgar CAYCE was born here on a small farm 8 miles from the Christian county town of Hopkinsville, Kentucky. He was the second child of Leslie and Carrie CAYCE, but the first to live. A daughter born 2 years earlier hadn't survived her first birthday. Edgar was particularly close with his grandparents, Sarah and Thomas Jefferson CAYCE. On a hot summer day in June 1881, Edgar, age 4, witnessed his grandfather's tragic death. They had been riding horseback when they came upon this pond near the farm. Edgar was let down, and his grandfather rode in to cool the animal.
The horse was scared by something and threw the grandfather off. He had his foot caught in a stirrup and drowned before anybody could get there, and Edgar witnessed that. He was on the bank.
Edgar claimed he was visited often by his dead grandfather in a barn where the tobacco crops were fired. Edgar said he would tell him stories about the Civil War and let him stroke his chin whiskers. These stories brought ridicule from some, but Edgar's mother and grandmother wouldn't allow him to be ashamed of his ability to see what others did not. At the age of 7, Edgar began his schooling in this one-room schoolhouse. In his own words, he was a dull student, but then he found a book that interested him, a gift Bible from his parents. He began studying it and soon was inspired to read it once through for every year of his life.
He read it every day. You have to read it every day to go through the whole Bible in a year. And he went through that Bible at least 67 or 68 times, at least that many times that he read it. And how many of us can tell we've went through the Bible one time? Not a bad book to know about.
In May of 1890, at age 13, Edgar's life changed forever. Already a baptized member of the Disciples of Christ Church, Edgar visited his favorite retreat in the woods near his home to reread the story of Samson and the vision of Manoah. That night, after Edgar prayed for the ability to help his fellow man, he received a vision of his own. He wrote later, "A glorious light as the rising morning sun seemed to fill the whole room, and a figure appeared at the foot of my bed, an angel or what I knew not. Patiently it said, 'Thy prayers are heard, you will have your wish. Remain faithful, be true to yourself. Help the sick, the afflicted.'" The next day, Edgar was in a daze at school, preoccupied with his vision. He was kept after class for repeatedly misspelling the word cabin. That night, his father tutored Edgar so late that the boy finally begged for a 5-minute break.
He just felt that if he could just sleep on that book a few minutes, he would know it better. So his father, my grandfather, said, "All right, you try it, and I'll be back in 5 minutes." And about 5 minutes later, he came back, and Dad knew every word in the book, which page it was on. And from then on, he just began sleeping on his books, and he became a rather bright student from an average student.
How Edgar learned his lessons this way was a mystery. At the very least, he had developed some sort of photographic memory. He used this ability to land a job at a bookstore by memorizing their sales catalog cover to cover. In 1892, excitement swept Christian County. Former resident Adlai E. Stevenson was Grover Cleveland's running mate. A day before a victory celebration in Hopkinsville, Edgar received a schoolyard injury when a baseball struck his spine. Later that day, he behaved wildly in class, shrieking with laughter. On the way home, he stood in the street and stopped traffic. That night, Edgar mystified his parents by giving detailed instructions for an herb poultice to be applied to his spinal injury while he slept. In the morning, he remembered nothing of his accident or strange behavior. But now neighbors began to talk, including a local doctor, the father of a young girl Edgar was smitten with.
He led Edgar to believe that he was in danger of going insane, which seems to me the ultimate in cruelty for a doctor to say that to a boy.
Some believe Edgar's psychic powers had been triggered by these boyhood incidences. But before she died, Edgar's grandmother hinted that her husband had powers too, that he could move tables and chairs with his mind. But Edgar had little time to ponder these mysteries. In 1893, at age 16, he was forced to leave school after completing only 8 grades and go to work in the fields. His father, who preferred the lofty title, the Squire, was barely keeping the family from poverty.
My father remembered the Squire, and he said that he would always have a clean bib, clean shirt on and tie, and well shaven, and he would just look like he was worth $1 million, but he wasn't.
Soon the CAYCE family quit the farm entirely to try their luck in town. They moved to this house in Hopkinsville. In 1895, when Edgar was 18, he fell in love with the prettiest young girl in town. Her name was Gertrude Evans.
She was patrician, he was a farm boy. It was an unlikely match. They were both people of faith, and they connected there. She saw in him idealism, beautiful idealism. She saw in him integrity. He was not phony. I think she saw in him adventure.
Edgar didn't wait long to ask for her hand in marriage, and Gertrude happily accepted. The wedding, however, would have to wait until Edgar found a better-paying job. In 1900, Edgar and his father began working as traveling insurance agents, but the business seemed doomed to fail. Edgar caught cold and suddenly lost his voice. Unable to pitch his product, he returned to Hopkinsville and took a job that didn't require him to speak: apprentice photographer. It was immediately clear in photographs of the town and of his favorite model, fiancée Gertrude, that Edgar had found a talent. But after 10 months of unsuccessful medical treatments, CAYCE was still without his normal speaking voice. He had lost all hope for a cure.
He tried everything. None of the doctors seemed able to help him. And the hypnotist in town, hypnotism was kind of a fad then. And somebody suggested trying hypnotism.
Intrigued, Edgar arranged a meeting with a local hypnotist named Al Lane. He would never forget the date, March 31st, 1901.
It was on a Sunday afternoon, and that after church, and that Al Lane came out to the house on West 7th Street, and they went into the dining room and closed the doors.
Edgar was instructed on self-hypnosis and with surprising ease put himself to sleep. Lane gave him the hypnotic suggestion that he speak in a normal tone of voice. After a minute, he began to mumble. Then, to everyone's shock, Edgar said in a clear, unafflicted voice, "Yes, we can see the body."
And he described the condition that he had. It was a circulatory problem in his throat. And it was said that it could be corrected by suggestion.
CAYCE was given the hypnotic suggestion that his circulation returned to normal. After a moment, he sat up and spat blood.
I don't say he was cured, but he was better at that respect. And cousin Sarah, who I talked to before she died, that was Edgar's sister, youngest sister, said that they would not let her in the room, but she peeked through the keyhole and saw it happen.
Edgar was elated, but not for long. His throat ailment, called aphonia, returned several times over the next year. Each time, Lane would conduct the reading, as he called it, and restore Edgar's voice. Lane, a mail-order osteopath, began to wonder if Edgar could diagnose other patients' ailments as well. He convinced CAYCE to try.
And so it was Al Lane who pushed him to do this, pretty much against Edgar's will. Edgar didn't really feel comfortable doing that because he didn't understand it.
While in his altered state, Edgar described illnesses in precise medical terms in language he knew nothing about in his waking state. Detailed remedies followed.
Sometimes he would call a prescription by name. I mean, take bromoquinine or take, castor oil or whatever it was that he was using.
But these strange powers and their implications terrified CAYCE. He had never studied medicine. He was no doctor and wondered what right he had to act like one. More and more he wanted out.
Who wouldn't say, I don't want this junk. It's too weird, it's too heavy. I don't want to see all this stuff or feel this kind of stuff or feel responsible for it.
When a job opened up at a bookstore in Bowling Green, 30 miles from home, Edgar jumped at the chance. There he joined the nearby church and began teaching Sunday school, something he had done since his early teens. At 22, there was only one thing he missed back in Hopkinsville: his bride-to-be. In June of 1903, after a 6-year engagement, Edgar CAYCE and Gertrude Evans married. CAYCE had begun his own photo studio in Bowling Green. He and his bride welcomed the escape from his reputation back home as a psychic doctor.
He didn't know how he did it. He just knew that he was able to do it, and he wanted to use it to help people.
But Bowling Green soon learned about CAYCE's abilities, and he could not say no to the needy. The readings resumed, and in the autumn of 1906, Edgar, then 29, was asked to demonstrate his trance diagnoses before local doctors.
They came first thinking, I'll expose this guy. I'll see through him. You could see the condescension in their faces.
Yes, we have the body, Edgar declared as he would by routine at the beginning of every reading. He correctly diagnosed a college student's attack of typhoid fever. Then, unexpectedly, some of the doctors tested Edgar's trance state by sticking needles into his hands and feet, certain he was a fake. CAYCE never flinched or bled, but when he awoke, he vowed angrily never again to be anyone's experiment.
Slowly, he began to learn that there weren't that many who really cared. A lot of people wanted to use him. Not many wanted to listen.
Edgar's safe haven had always been the church. Now he wondered, as did his fellow churchgoers, whether his gift was a blessing or a curse.
Evidently, some of the people in the congregation really got upset, that thought that this character was teaching Sunday school to their children on Sunday morning.
Edgar was accused of the church's worst offense, heresy. Though he was later declared innocent, it was a painful experience for CAYCE. In response, he worked harder than ever, adding a second studio and taking on consignment $40,000 worth of art from New York. Business was so good that Edgar and Gertrude planned on building their own home with the profits. Then, disaster struck. 2 days before Christmas 1906, fire destroyed the studio. The unsold New York artwork would plunge Edgar $8,000 in debt. Incredibly, another fire would strike his second studio within the year. Edgar needed some good fortune. It came in a 9.5-pound bundle. Hugh Lynn CAYCE was born in March of 1907. Edgar, the new father, eventually paid all his debts, but was forced to move in with Gertrude's disappointed family back in Hopkinsville. There, his father introduced him to homeopathic practitioner Dr. Wesley Ketchum.
Ketchum was pretty much a promoter, and he wrote a paper that was read at a big clinical medical society in Boston. The New York Times covered this and gave Edgar a full-page treatment, which is hard to imagine these days.
The Times article, trumpeting CAYCE as an illiterate, was widely read. Soon, over 10,000 letters requesting readings were sent to Edgar by the chronically ill or those who had lost hope with conventional doctors. Many sent money, though CAYCE had never charged for a reading before.
Edgar knew that he didn't do it. It came through him, and it was a gift that could come through him. I think that's the reason his ability was so good, because he didn't have concern of making money on it. It was really pure to help other people.
Ketchum offered to finance a photo studio in return for Edgar's readings. The time had arrived to decide how to use these powers. After a sleepless night, Edgar agreed, but on his own terms. His father would conduct the readings and a stenographer record them for later review. And the money, nearly $2,000, would be sent back until services were rendered. Edgar's course was set.
I noticed on one occasion, he said, some people ask me whether I'm a spiritualist or whether I'm a medium. And he said, I guess the term for me is a psychic, but I really think of myself as a man of God.
CAYCE settled into a routine of giving 2 readings a day, lasting approximately 45 minutes each.
It wasn't anything weird, as a lot of people would think. Dad would simply lie down on a couch or bed. He had a couch in his office. If he had a tie on, he would loosen his tie and just cross his hands over his stomach and just lay back and relax.
When Edgar's eyelids began to flutter, the conductor, Edgar's father, and Gertrude in later years would know Edgar was in trance. The suggestion was then given, the name of the person and where they would be at the time of the reading.
Now, the person could be in the room, or he could be in another state or another city. It didn't matter. I remember one time he had a reading on a man who was supposed to be in an apartment in New York. Dad lay there a minute and says, we do not have the body. I said, he's not here. I said, he's on a bus coming across town. I said, there was a traffic accident. The bus is late. I said, he'll be here in a minute. We'll wait. And all of a sudden, he said, he's come in now.
A call to the man in New York later verified everything CAYCE had said.
Now, there's a beautiful piece of clairvoyance, of something that somebody couldn't have anticipated that would, seems to me, point to the accuracy of his readings.
From his sleep state, CAYCE demonstrated a remarkable knowledge of anatomy, as if he were looking right into the patient's body. To the continual surprise of doctors called in later for second opinions, CAYCE would pinpoint the problem, say a blood disorder resulting in anemia, and then offer a remedy. Most were home or herbal concoctions and included diet restrictions as well. When Edgar discovered that some patients weren't fully following his often detailed remedies, he began to envision a hospital with supervised care. It would become his obsession. By the spring of 1911, the future was looking bright for CAYCE and family. A second son, Milton Porter, was born at this home in Hopkinsville. But Milton developed severe whooping cough and colitis. Edgar gave a reading, but the child could not be saved. Milton CAYCE died in his second month.
The son that did not survive was a shock to both of them. And Gertrude's illness followed. She had, I suppose what we call postpartum depression and more.
Gertrude was a woman of beauty and strength, but the death of her infant son shook her to the core. Her health declined, and she developed tuberculosis, which had killed her brother. After doctors gave her a week to live, she appealed to Edgar for a reading.
And Edgar did it, but he was scared to death because this was the person he loved most, and he was scared that he might say something that would be fatal. Turned out just the opposite. And he says that that really was the turning point. From then on, he said, if that could happen for the one he loved most, then it might mean that that's what he was supposed to be doing.
Gertrude fully recovered, her health monitored by what Edgar called check readings. But his newfound faith was betrayed by, of all people, his own father and Dr. Ketchum. When Edgar in trance asked any questions, as he always would, they began to ask for tips on the commodities market and even on horse races.
He began to discover that they were playing games with him. He became very angry, and he terminated his relationship with them and even left town.
His father's betrayal would take years to reconcile. Selma, Alabama offered refuge for the CAYCEs, and Edgar opened a new studio, the CAYCE Art Company. But his unusual powers would once again be needed by 6-year-old son Hugh Lynn.
It wasn't until my brother dropped a match in a partially filled can of flashlight powder and burned his eyes real badly, and the doctor said he'd never see again, and that's when he started giving readings again.
After doctors insisted that one of Hugh Lynn's badly burned eyes be removed, Edgar gave a reading. A seemingly dangerous remedy of a tannic acid solution saved his son's sight. The CAYCES welcomed another son, Edgar Evans, in 1918 as the First World War raged in Europe. Edgar had seen many of his former Sunday school pupils go off to fight. Now 40, he was beginning to feel old, but his dream of building a hospital seemed more urgent than ever.
At the end of World War I, this was kicked him into the whole hospital venture. He discovered that his readings could outline treatments for shell-shock veterans, and nobody else knew what to do with them. There were a lot of them, and those who followed his instructions got better.
When a young Kentucky friend, David Kahn, returned safely from the trenches in France, he asked Edgar to consider something he had never agreed to before: to use his psychic abilities to raise money for the hospital. Coincidentally, CAYCE had just received a request from a Texas newspaperman for readings on oil prospects. Edgar CAYCE's life was about to take a most dramatic turn. In 1920, Edgar CAYCE and friend David Kahn had visions of making millions as wildcatters, with their oil profits funding Edgar's dream hospital project. But these would be some of the toughest years of CAYCE's life.
Well, you know, I often think of his 3 years in Texas as his wilderness experience. I think he was wandering around in the wilderness.
The CAYCE Petroleum Company was founded in San Saba, and drilling began on oil leases Edgar had recommended in his readings. But the oil never came. Months turned into years, and it got so grim that Edgar's associates started wearing guns when some of the wells were sabotaged by cutthroat competitors. CAYCE came to the sobering realization that his psychic powers had become unreliable. They had dramatically failed him and turned the noble mission to finance his hospital into a colossal defeat. Absent for 3 long years, some would claim Edgar had failed his family as well.
Certainly to put my grandfather on a pedestal as someone without human frailties or someone that had all-knowing abilities and never make mistakes with his readings, that was not the Edgar CAYCE that I have come to understand.
CAYCE refused to return empty-handed. He crisscrossed the country searching for money and finally raised a pledge for $60,000 for the hospital to be built in Birmingham, Alabama. But by now, CAYCE's readings had indicated that the hospital must be built in the obscure resort town of Virginia Beach, Virginia.
Well, he said that the ocean was had a good effect some way on his psychic abilities, or in any psychic, that it was a good place for him to be.
The Birmingham offer was promptly withdrawn. Beaten, Edgar finally rejoined his family in Selma. He returned to what he knew: photography, teaching Sunday school, and tried to forget his fundraising failures. But this peaceful routine ended abruptly. In 1923, after meeting an Ohio businessman and potential hospital investor, Edgar uprooted his family once again and moved to Dayton, Ohio. It was yet another gamble, as it was for an 18-year-old Selma native who felt her destiny belonged with the CAYCES. She was Edgar's new stenographer. Her name was Gladys Davis.
Gladys was kind of like one of the family, and she had a phenomenal memory. She could, like a computer, she could tell you who had a reading on what date and what it was about.
In Dayton, CAYCE underwent a radical change. During a reading for his potential investor, Edgar was asked deep metaphysical questions about the nature of the human soul. CAYCE, in trance, began to talk of his questioner's past lives.
Well, this really blew Edgar over, you know, because this ran counter not only to what he believed, he said, as a Christian, but what he taught as a Sunday school teacher.
Edgar knew the Gospels well and wondered why the Bible never mentioned reincarnation, if indeed it was real. CAYCE began to study the scriptures in a new context.
And he said it soon became evident to him that there were places in the Bible which, if you read them and read them carefully, you could see that they supported the idea of reincarnation.
CAYCE's readings on past lives became known as life readings, as opposed to the physical readings he previously had been giving.
And so he started giving readings for everybody in his family, and they'd all had past lives according to his readings. And many of their lives, they were together in some other place, ancient Egypt primarily.
Edgar began studying other beliefs, from Hinduism to the religions of ancient Egypt and Greece. He would withhold judgment on reincarnation for some years. It was, after all, unprovable. But CAYCE wondered whether his readings on past lives could be just as accurate as one of his physical readings, which he and others were able to verify. With so many questions at hand, CAYCE's future seemed inescapable. In 1923, at 46, he became a full-time psychic, a vocational choice that few understood, many ridiculed, and added little to his bank account.
He wasn't a very good money handler himself. I mean, the money would go through his hands just like sand from the beach. He would cause Mother a lot of problems sometimes.
Gertrude, who had come from money back in Kentucky, would struggle her whole life with her husband's financial woes. When the Dayton money source dried up, she was worn out. She felt no reason to be optimistic when a new financial angel emerged. Morton Blumenthal and his brother Edwin ran a successful Wall Street brokerage firm. After an introduction from David Kahn, Morton became an instant CAYCE supporter. He offered to fund the Virginia Beach Hospital and buy the CAYCEs a home near the beach. It was almost too good to be true.
It seemed like a little fishing village when we first came to the beach. It didn't look like, you know, what Dad said it was going to be, a thriving community.
Edgar and family settled on 35th Street. The next summer, construction began on the CAYCE Hospital, and the sleepy town began to buzz about this curious new enterprise. In partnership with the Blumenthals, Edgar began a corporation, the Association of National Investigators. Science, education, health, and spiritual awakening were the stated pursuits. This activity proved a tonic for Edgar. He had just returned from the Hopkinsville funeral of his beloved mother, Carrie. Edgar's father, alone now and past errors forgiven, came to live with his son. In November of 1928, Edgar's dream became reality. The CAYCE Hospital, the only institution of its kind in the world where physical ills would be diagnosed via psychic revelation, was dedicated. It had been a long and difficult road for Edgar CAYCE. Here was all he dreamed and desired, or so it seemed. In early 1929, after years of hard work, Edgar CAYCE saw his hospital accept its first patient. Headed by his friend from Kentucky, Dr. Thomas House, it featured the latest in osteopathic equipment and massage technique, homeopathic remedies, and a low-fat diet. CAYCE's readings began to suggest treatments with low levels of electricity applied to the body, something chiropractic patients today would be familiar with.
Dad said one day they would be able to take a drop of blood and diagnose the condition of the human body. At the time he said it, it was ridiculous, but now it's a normal procedure.
Edgar proudly noted that the building and grounds, complete with gardens and a tennis court, felt more like a large home than a hospital. CAYCE had survived all the skeptics that called him a fake, a charlatan, and a heretic. Here was his triumph. Life in Virginia Beach was rich, and during the warm summers, magical.
And everybody at the beach used to call him Doc because they thought he was a doctor, but he liked to garden, he liked to fish. All these sand dunes up here were covered with grapevines, so Dad used to go out, and we used to go out and pick grapes, and he'd make grape jelly and wine from them. He was a very ordinary person when he was awake. It was just those 30 or 40 minutes when he was asleep that he was unusual.
During his trips to Virginia Beach, Morton Blumenthal stayed at the newly completed Cavalier Hotel. He had budgeted $3,000 a month to run the hospital after an initial investment of over $100,000. As long as he was informed beforehand, CAYCE had come to accept financial questions during his readings. On April 6, 1929, Blumenthal sought advice on the booming stock market. CAYCE warned, there must surely come a break where it would be panic in the money centers. The reading proved prophetic. 6 months later, the market crashed. Against the background of the Great Depression came the unthinkable. The hospital failed less than 3 years after it opened. A biographer would later write that Edgar, devastated, wandered the empty corridors collecting keepsakes, including a photograph of his mother.
It was a real blow. It was, we had moved to the beach, the hospital had been built, it was operating, people were getting well, then all of a sudden it was down to where he started from.
If Edgar CAYCE had a weakness, it was his inability to say no. As manager of the hospital, he approved extravagant expenditures, free treatments and meals for his staff and friends. He wanted to please everyone, make time for anyone who asked for it. But this weakness was also part of his gift.
His home, his privacy was invaded constantly. People would knock on his door at all hours of the day and night. And they had to be gracious to all of the visitors, and they were.
He could mark people with the genius of their lives if they let him. Wide awake, talk with them, get hold of them. They go away marked for good.
The popular story was that the misfortunes on Wall Street ruined the Blumenthals. The evidence suggests they emerged unscathed. Some believe the hospital closure came after a power struggle between Morton and Edwin Blumenthal and David Kahn over who had primary access to Edgar's unique abilities. When Kahn won, the Blumenthals pulled out. Later, Edgar wrote with characteristic goodwill, "I blame no one else but myself for its failure."
The readings were kind of few and far between, and after that, it was tough times.
David Kahn made a fortune in the furniture business, thanks in part to Edgar's readings. The Blumenthals and CAYCE never spoke again. Edgar walked away from his hospital flat broke. Later that year, 1931, CAYCE rallied. He called a meeting of his closest supporters, like-minded people who believed in his work. He began a new organization, the Nonprofit Association for Research and Enlightenment. Readings would be given free to those unable to pay, and Edgar would receive an annual salary. During a fundraising trip to New York, Edgar gave a reading to a woman who had claimed to be in desperate need. The woman and her companion turned out to be policewomen, and Edgar, Gertrude, and Gladys Davis were arrested for fortune-telling. 31 years earlier, back in Hopkinsville, Edgar had feared that his powers might lead him down the wrong path. Now they had, and he was headed to jail, much to the delight of the tabloid press.
They took a picture of Dad and took a picture of all three of them, and they cut Mother out of the picture and said, "Psychic arrested in motel with blonde secretary." Really great headline.
The New York case was thin. The policewoman had signed a release and had not been solicited. The charges were dismissed. But in 1935 in Detroit, Edgar was found guilty for practicing medicine without a license. Though he was freed on probation with no sentence or fine imposed, CAYCE was mortified. Soon after returning from Detroit, Edgar had a dream of reincarnating in Nebraska in the year 2100. In the dream, he finds that his works as Edgar CAYCE are still known.
It came to him at a time when he was feeling very distraught. He was wondering whether his work was really of value, whether it would continue. And so this dream really served as a source of encouragement for him.
CAYCE's readings, which were expanding in detail and scope, were also encouraging. He began to describe as best he could the journey his consciousness would take when in trance.
He would describe moving up through a beam of light, passing images and sounds, and his consciousness moving to other dimensions that are related to vast sources of information.
CAYCE called this source of information the Akashic Record, where every thought, sound, or event from the beginning of time is recorded. He believed he could access this resource, as well as his subject's subconscious mind, telepathically, to answer any question posed to him. The concept boggled the mind, then as now.
That this man would lie down on a couch and essentially go to sleep and come up with this information, it's just too big a jump for lots of scientists and trained medical professionals today.
Edgar's personal life readings indicated 17 different incarnations as a high priest in Egypt, a nomadic ruler in Persia, and in the fabled Atlantis, which he mentioned nearly 700 times. He described a highly advanced society that collapsed over a span of 40,000 years, with its survivors settling partly in Egypt. CAYCE, nearing 60, seemed to sense his time was limited. Readings of past, present, and future were now spilling out. By the mid-1930s, Edgar CAYCE had gained a loyal following as a gifted psychic. Skeptics could say he made the whole thing up, but the hundreds of verified physical readings were difficult to dispute. He was right about the crash of 29, and in 1935 predicted the Japanese would join Germany and Austria as a world threat, a bizarre idea at the time. But some readings were so astonishing that even supporters had difficulty grasping them. CAYCE said the Earth's poles would shift in 1936, resulting in massive geological changes. CAYCE predicted flooding would destroy cities on both coasts of North America, and new land, the sunken remnants of Atlantis, would dramatically appear off Florida by 1969.
The stuff about Atlantis was hard to verify, and it's possible that his mind slipped, that he didn't have a good filter.
I don't think this was an area of Edgar CAYCE's readings that was especially fruitful or especially accurate.
CAYCE had no apology for the limits of his psychic ability, why he was accurate in one instance and not in another. Though he continued to make world predictions, he never considered himself a prophet.
I don't think he was a prophet as such. I mean, he did make statements about the future, but he always said the future's not fixed. You know, we can change it.
By the early 1940s, Edgar and Gertrude had settled into a comfortable home on Lake Holly, which doubled as headquarters for the ARE, Edgar's Association for Research and Enlightenment. This is the only motion picture footage that exists of Edgar CAYCE, happily playing host during the 1943 ARE membership meeting. Though thousands of CAYCE's readings were transcribed, only one audio recording survives. In a reading on his own health, CAYCE, a lifelong smoker, is asked if he should cut down on his smoking.
Any stimuli to expect is and moderation. Moderation would mean, for this body, anywhere from 3 to 6 to 8 smokes a day. Above this will be expected.
CAYCE's own health would suffer not only from smoking, but from giving too many readings. For most of his adult years, Edgar gave 2 readings a day. That all changed with the publication of a CAYCE biography by Thomas Shagru, a friend of CAYCE's son Hugh Lynn. It was titled, "There is a River," from Edgar's favorite Psalm 46.
There is a river, the streams thereof make glad the city of God. Meaning that not river, as we say, but a stream of thought, a stream of consciousness that Edgar tapped.
The book, together with an article in Coronet magazine, made CAYCE a celebrity of sorts. It brought in thousands of requests for readings and some rather amusing propositions.
Men wanted to take him to Washington and Wall Street. Women wanted to take him to bed, bear his child for the good of humanity. It was never easy. June and I were posted to guard his hotel room in New York from the women admirers.
In 1943, author Harmon Brough and his fiancée June worked in Casey's office, answering the voluminous mail.
I helped to open some of those letters, and to see the pain in them was almost staggering. It was heartbreaking.
The letters came from the terminally ill and from families looking for clues about their sons missing in action overseas. Once again, Edgar could not say no. He began giving as many as 8 readings a day, over 1,300 between June of 1943 and June of 44. Each seemed to take a little more out of the 66-year-old Casey.
He felt like he had to help those people. He knew he couldn't do it, and yet he felt like he had to do it, I guess, and it killed him.
In August 1944, Edgar collapsed from overwork. He gave one final reading for himself. It advised rest until well or dead. The Caseys went to the mountains of Virginia to recuperate, but Edgar soon suffered a stroke. May Sinclair, a Casey office worker, visited them and felt as others did, that Edgar belonged back at the beach.
He said to me with a tear in his voice, "Why did you come?" And I said, "I came to take you home." "Do you really mean it?" I said, "Mr. Casey, if you want to go home, you're going to go home."
Edgar came home to Virginia Beach in November. He traveled through the autumn countryside to the shore in an ambulance arranged by son Edgar Evans. But his health never returned. On January 3rd, 1945, Edgar Casey died at age 67. He was laid to rest back in Hopkinsville.
And his mother died 3 months later, on Easter morning when the sun was coming up. I think she kind of lost her reason for living after he died.
Edgar Casey left over 14,000 documented readings on health, philosophy, religion, business, past lives, and future events. No other psychic left such an extensive record, but many feel the word psychic is inadequate when describing Edgar Casey.
I think Mr. Casey has given us a definition of a human being, of what a human being really is, that we truly are one, body, mind, and spirit, and that we do create our own reality.
If Edgar Casey did what he did, there is more to us than a physical body. That immediately has implications for the age-old questions of humanity. Who are we? What's the purpose of life? What happens to us when we die? All of that.
Casey's legacy, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, has continued to grow and attract visitors from around the world. Hundreds of books in 18 languages examine the life and work of the most renowned psychic of our time. In the end, Casey left perhaps the most daring of challenges. He said, "I don't do anything you can't do, if you're willing to pay the price."